as the narrative moved from control to reform, to opening up, there was a strange kind of acceptance, interestingly, from the government sector. In fact, it went to a huge extreme where the government, when I joined it, almost everybody thought that this was the end of government, that there will be no role for the government anymore. So in the early 90s, the idea was that it will be entirely private sector led. There will be really nothing except maybe the military, which the government will run, and maybe some aspects of tax collection. The pendulum then swung a little bit 10 or 15 years later, when suddenly the government came back and realized that no, it was not going to be all private sector, that there are areas where governance is still very critical. And that is when we realized much later in the day, and therefore we missed some of that buses, which is that we did not build up an adequate regulatory mechanism that is important for an open economy. And that is why we lost out on those 10, 12 years where we just gave up and said that government is useless, it has no role, and therefore it should just recede. And after all the various scams and so on that we saw, we realized no, that the government has a very important, far more important regulatory role to play in an open environment than ever before. But that requires a great deal of training and sophistication and knowledge and skills. And that we've started building rather late in the day. That is why you will find that most of the opposition or most of the skepticism to India's growth comes from the fact that India has a poor regulatory framework, a pure bureaucratic structure. One thing I remember very well, which is so evocative of the pre-reform period, was the placement season. So you would wait for these 2 or 3 firms to come, purely public sector firms, offer you ridiculously low salaries of about $100 a month, and get delighted when 10% of us will get very low paid jobs. So I remember that when we were in 87 graduating out of engineering college and getting a job, some of us very proudly and arrogantly said that I will in 5 years time buy a scooter. That was the level of our aspiration and our expectation, because that was the kind of era that was there. So that was the Hyderabad at that time, a very small city. It hadn't yet seen the explosion that it later saw by way of a reform in the service sector, and it became a very large economy of the call center type. And we had to, people like us had to move from one government job to another. And remember those days very well. These were the 80s when we were trying to opt for a career, and the only career at that time was engineering. And that's one of the major issues of the pre-reform era, because what used to happen then was that in the absence of a service industry, the only industry that we could find work in was the manufacturing sector. And therefore you would find this very hilarious situation that you later see in films like Three Idiots, where every South Indian was told to become an engineer because there were no other jobs. But what will definitely change is the number of jobs and the number of opportunities, and the fact that there is a far greater choice of career than there ever was. Some of us students went to Nepal in December when it's really cold. For poor South Indians, that -2 degrees was desperately cold. But we were going from an iron curtain India. So what did we have? What did we buy? The first thing we reached Kathmandu was a bottle of Fanta. And because that was what liberalisation, open market meant for us. So, and then there are so many issues that I can talk about. The big thing that I see is that opening up and liberalisation enabled us to understand that the solution to demand is supply. The solution to demand is not control. Earlier our idea was that if people demand something, then stop them from demanding it, and that will cause that will be the solution. Today we know that if people demand a product, let people who want to supply, and when you allow a lot of them to supply, then the price will come down. That's been a big learning of liberalisation, and that I think is a learning that percolates to every level of India's citizen.